anyone would be lucky to date me. I was what my 4th grade teacher called gifted and talented, and what my peers called obnoxious during awards because I was constantly standing up to receive them. I peaked in elementary school. In today's TED Talk, we're going to be talking about how, while myself and many others thrived off the label of being gifted and talented, the implications are hefty and oftentimes damaging of being what is called a gifted kid burnout, such as myself. First, we're going to be going over how gifted and talented students are identified, before moving on to the short-term and long-term implications of being a gifted and talented burnout, before finally moving on to some solutions. So, I think it would be pretty funny to watch middle schoolers and elementary schoolers like fight to the death to see who gets the best computer or the best crayons or the best whatever, but in what should come to a shock to no one at all, the way that we identify gifted and talented students all comes down to a test. The Maryland Public School District gives teachers a broad instruction to test all of their students so that way they can just weed out their inferior kids and toss them into the average class because, as we all know, being average is the absolute worst thing that an elementary school student can be. Now, this might not be that bad if the qualifications for being gifted weren't so broad as well. The Teddy School District defines gifted and talented as students, youth, or children who exhibit high achieving capabilities in one or more of the following areas: art, writing, math, music, leadership, you know, all the things that 1st graders are really good at exhibiting. And under this definition falls a whopping 3.2 million children, according to the National Association for Gifted and Talented Students. And while the definition of gifted and talented is incredibly broad, as we can see, there is so much more to being gifted and talented than just being good at something. So let's talk about some of the long-term and short-term implications of being a gifted and talented student. I want you to raise your hand if you were considered gifted and talented in high school, middle school, or elementary school. Wow, this is really sad. I was gonna say raise your hand if you're on antidepressants now, but since I'm already sad, might as well fix it. Good thing I have these. Now, the implications of being a gifted kid burnout can be summed up into one thing: burnout bingo. Burnout bingo first appeared in a 2017 Instagram meme. What's part of burnout bingo? Feel free to play along if you're at home. Being diagnosed with something like depression, check. Existential anxiety, check. Easily bored, check. Issues with authority, check. Always making excuses, check. Losing interest in anything that doesn't come easily to you, check. I feel like I'm gonna get bingo like 8 times, but don't quote me because I wasn't in the math gifted and talented program. Whatever. Now, Tom Wyman, who is a writer for Outline magazine, takes a scathing approach to burnt out gifted kids in his 2018 article, How Bad Should We Really Feel for Burnt Out Gifted Kids? Essentially telling them that they were no more special than anyone else and that they need to stop waiting for their parents to dote on them. Okay, boomer. The reality cannot be any more different. For example, a Cornell study found that both among self-identified and school-identified gifted and talented children, the rates for what are called situational depression is much higher. Essentially, when they enter into a new situation, gifted and talented students expect to be perfect. This is because of something that Dr. Ann Smith calls never enough syndrome. It's essentially perfectionism. They go into every situation believing that they're going to be perfect at something, that because they were labeled as gifted, they need to excel at literally everything, even though, as we saw in my first point, being gifted is so much more than just excelling at something. The American Psychological Association identifies that part of this never enough syndrome comes from parents' expectations often exceeding what their child can realistically do. Essentially, it puts these kids in a cycle of feeling like they need to be perfect, but then not being perfect, and then being chemically depressed because they feel like they should be perfect, even though that's literally impossible for them to do. This is because of the label that is put on them as early as kindergarten or 1st grade in some, where both their parents, their teachers, and their peers are now expecting them to be above average in literally everything because they're labeled as gifted. And when we examine this, we can see that both the long-term and short-term implications are going to be terrible. We've already looked at the long-term implications, but short-term, these gifted kids suck at studying. Essentially what happens is when gifted and talented kids get to places like high school where they're taking AP classes, They're not ready for the workload because, as we established, they've been told that they're good at everything. I mean, why was I going to study for my spelling test for 45 minutes when I knew I was going to get 100 and that Harry Potter book looked real appealing? I wasn't going to study for that spelling test, and neither were any of the other gifted and talented children, which is why when we got to places like high school and the reading was longer, the writing was longer, we actually had to study for things in order to do well at them, we see an average that their grades drop, according to Beyond Booksmart. Now, not enough to identify them as average, because God, how bad would that be? But we do see that this causes some of that situational depression, especially because we see them noticing that their average peers have caught up or are even surpassing them because they learned how to study. Now, the solution to this is really mind-blowing. So everybody take a second. The solution is just giving every kid a good education. Shocking, I know. Essentially, the New York Times on August 26th of 2019 reports that New York Mayor Bill de Blasio is seeking to desegregate schools in favor of a school-wide enrichment model. Essentially what this does is it removes the label of gifted and talented, but it still keeps the whole gifted and talented curriculum. Because as we established, the problem isn't necessarily with the curriculum of gifted and talented, it is with the fact that children are being labeled and pressured as gifted. Basically what the school-wide enrichment model aims to do, according to the University of Connecticut, is it identifies what children naturally excel in without putting any sorts of labels on them. These kids will focus on that for most of the day before moving on to subjects like math if they excel in reading, or reading if they excel in math. And what the University of Connecticut found was that this was so much better overall for their long-term mental health as well as for their long-term comprehension of what they were trying to learn. Basically, because they were able to do what they were naturally good at and enjoyed doing, they were more open to learning about things that they might not have been as receptive to if they had not been able to pursue those other interests. So let's take a step back and look at everything that we talked about today. First, we talked about how gifted kids are identified before moving on to both the long-term and short-term implications of being a gifted kid burnout, before looking at something that might help solve the issues that we give gifted kids by putting that label of gifted on them. Thanks for coming to my TED Talk.